This is a really great question. Is all sex magic shadow work? My first inclination is to say no, but unfortunately, because of the cultures that we're brought up in, there is so much trauma around sexuality that it's hard to go down the path of sex magic without encountering a shadow, or sometimes even the threshold into sacred sexuality is the shadow. So there's two ways of thinking about the shadow. There's kind of the Jungian idea of the shadow being this archetypical symbol for the opposite. And then there's also the fact that the shadow is kind of this like hidden thing. It's, in Tantra, we have this idea that the shadow is really this piece of the way that God hides itself from itself, the way that we hide our divinity from our divinity so that we can discover it again. So when I'm thinking about the shadow, I'm often thinking about the ways that I actually hide from myself. Often. And then there's this other piece of the shadow, which is that it's the darkness and that it's bad or that it's wrong. And so I've talked about before how when we're thinking about the shadow, we can think about it in this many dimensional way, in a way that's not just, oh, it's the darkness or oh, it's the hidden. It's many things, and it really depends on how you want to work through that energy. Sometimes when we're facing like in the psychic realm, if you're doing a lot of like ceremonial magic and astral travel, you encounter like these pockets of density. And those can feel like shadow to us as humans, but really it's just a density that we're not super comfortable with. And, particularly in sex magic, that can bring up fear. It can help us to process our trauma. So I don't necessarily consider trauma and the shadow to be the exact same thing. I think if we have patterns around sexuality that we haven't necessarily unpacked yet, then shadow work is a really great way to have access to, the answers to those questions. Why do I behave this way? Why do I feel this way? Why is it that I believe this thing, right, about like, everyone is worthy of pleasure, but then I behave in a way that like, oh, I get jealous when someone has more pleasure than me, right? Or my belief is that love is infinite and that there is no end to love. But then in practice, I have scarcity around love and I'm really codependent in relationships. So when you find those things where your belief doesn't align with your behavior, shadow work, as a practice can help you access that. But how you define the shadow and how you walk through your trauma to find healing, that's totally up to you. That's why, sex magic and shadow work, they often go together. It's really this cultural programming thing. A lot of us were conceived in trauma. A lot of us were brought up in the first 7 years in trauma. And so if you're working with that lower energy center at the base, at the root, with the earth, it's hard to deny. We're products of colonization. The earth and nature, which is the ultimate symbol and manifestation of sexuality, is deeply traumatized by the shadow of ambition and greed, right? So the answer is yes and no.